Photoshop frequency separation can take your images from this to this. Let me show you how. Frequency separation seems to be the latest hot technique in Photoshop. If you have a look on YouTube, what you'll find is lots and lots of videos talking about how to use it with retouching, and typically it's portraits and beauty shots. You don't see many videos at all on the subject of landscape photography. So I thought I'm going to redress this balance today, and I'm going to show you two ways you can use frequency separation to enhance a landscape image like the one I have on screen. Now I will say that this technique was really inspired having watched a video by a portrait photographer, and that was Glyn Dewis. He did a live stream on YouTube the other day, and he did it really well, and it inspired me to see how I could apply it, or apply the techniques, to landscape photography. And if you're interested in going watching his original live stream, I'll put a link in the details below. So the first thing is, let's talk about what frequency separation is. And it's probably easiest if I explain it as I go along. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create two layers from my image. And the first layer I'm going to rename to be colour. And the reason I call it colour is because that layer will have all the colour information from the image, but none of the detail. And the other layer I'm going to rename detail, because that's going to have all the detail information, but none of the colour. So what we've done is we've separated the image into two components, colour and detail, and that's all frequency separation is. You can get far more complicated with it, but at this stage we don't need to. I'm going to save that for another video at a later date. So let's start with our colour layer. How do we create colour but no detail? Well, it's actually quite simple. We're going to blur the layer using a Gaussian blur filter. And I'm going to use a setting of only 5 pixels, and you can vary this as you'll see later in this video. But for the moment, trust me, 5 pixels is what we need. So you can see the difference there with the normal layer and the blurred layer. So on the detailed layer, what we need to do is create a layer that has all detail information but no colour. So the way I'm going to do that is using Apply Image under the Image menu. Now when you want to create this detail layer, there's a few things you have to check in this box. So the first one is that you're selecting the layer that you've just blurred. So I called mine colour, so we've got that selected. The next thing you want to do is select the blending mode. Usually this thing's at normal, and that won't do you any good. What you need to do is select Add. And also you need to have this invert option checked. If we come down, the other thing that's important is the scale, which we should have set to 2, and the offset set to 0. And again, I'm not going to explain the ins and outs of how this works because that's a little bit too complicated for an introductory video. So once you've done that, you can click OK. And what you've got in here is the detail from the image, which you can see very faintly, all on a mid-tone grey background. Now the reason we want it on a mid-tone grey background is because that allows us to set the blending mode. And what we're going to do is use a contrast enhancing blending mode. So watch what happens now if I turn this into linear light. All of a sudden the grey disappears, and what we're getting is contrast enhancement on the areas that are white and dark in that layer. So it's blending them in with the original layer. That detail layer and that colour layer really belong together, so I'm going to just group them and I can turn them on and off. And at the moment you can see they're not having any effect at all. Let's just zoom into 100% and we'll focus ourselves on this rock. So nothing's happening. Let's just expand that group, and if I turn off the detail layer, you can see it's blurred again. If I turn off the colour layer, watch what happens to the image. Massive contrast enhancement, and that's what causes the sharpening effect. So one of the ways we can use frequency separation is to sharpen our images. So I'm going to rename this group to be Sharpening. Now at the moment, if it's not having any effect when the colour layer's on, but it's having a massive effect when the colour layer's off, what we can do is we can actually reduce the opacity of that colour layer. And as we start to do that, you can see the sharpening effect comes in. So I'm going to leave this now for this image around about 60%. So you can see the difference with the sharpening effect on and off. Let's zoom into 200% magnification now. That's with sharpening on. That's with sharpening off. It's making quite a difference to that. And let's go up now and look at the sky. Because typically you'll find noise in the sky. But even sharpening with this method, you're not seeing any real emphasis of noise in the sky anymore. And that's because we're not sharpening any of the detail. Let's come down now to the rocks again. And although we've actually applied our sharpening through the colour layer, I'm just going to actually push that up to about 70, just to reduce the effect slightly. Because the other thing you can do is you can actually take this detail layer and you can sharpen it. So let's use the unsharp mask filter. Now you could use smart sharpening if you prefer, but I'm just going to use unsharp mask for simplicity. And straight away, as soon as I apply that, you can see the effect on that layer. It's sharpening it even more. So I'm going to keep, rather than having a high threshold, I'm going to actually push the threshold down to 0 so we do sharpen all the detail. I'm going to use a very low radius of about 0.6 and I'm going to actually push the sharpening up quite high. And what we're doing there is we're applying some very, very fine sharpening that's the equivalent of capture sharpening. And I've applied that through to the detail layer. So again, we're not seeing any problems in the sky when we've done this. All we've done is sharpen detail, not the colour information in the image, or not the noise in the image. Let's go back to looking at what it's like on the full screen. It's looking good, and at 100% it's actually looking very, very sharp and possibly even over sharpened. I'll turn it off so you can see the original. And there's the new version, nice and crisp. So that's one way you can use frequency separation. Let's turn that off now and I'll show you another. For this example, we're going to create the Orton effect. So I'll just fit the image to the screen again. And I'm going to start off just the way I did before. I'm going to duplicate 2 layers. And the first layer I'm going to call Colour. And I'm going to call this Blur 30. The other one I'll still call Detail. Again, I'm going to start by blurring my colour layer. And this time, rather than using a blur radius of 5, you've probably guessed this, I'm going to use a blur radius of 30. The next thing I'm going to do is go into my detail layer and I'm going to again use the apply image. What I want to do is pick the blur layer that corresponds with the effect I'm trying to create. So this one is all about colour blur 30. Again, it's inverted, blending mode of add, scale of 2, offset of 0. And I'm going to click OK. And I can set the blending mode to linear light, and nothing seems to have very much effect. And as I say, it's not having any effect. What I can do is, rather than have a detail layer blended using linear light, I could pick soft light, and immediately we're getting a blurring effect. And that's because what we've created in the detail layer isn't countering the colour blur because the blending mode is not strong enough. You've got other blending modes you can use in here as well as soft light. So for example, you could go to hard light and that's got a little bit of a stronger effect. Vivid light or linear light, which is what counteracts the blurring. For the moment, I'll stick with linear light. And I'm going to reduce the opacity down, and that creates a nice glowing effect because there's not enough strength in that detail layer to actually counter the blur of the image below it. And again, we could have created that using the hard light, that gives an even different blurring effect, and even soft light, which gives another effect, as does overlay. So you need to be selective as to which of these you want when you're actually coming to do it yourself. Now, look what happens when I turn on sharpening. It actually counters the effect that we've just added with the blur. So, how do we create the Orton effect? Well, it's quite straightforward from here. All we need to do is duplicate this blur layer. And this time the blur layer, we're actually going to say soft blur. And the reason we're going to do that is we're going to change its blending mode. And we're going to change it to soft light. And now we can reduce or control the amount of soft light coming through in that area, and that's created a nice glowing Orton effect on the image. We can turn on the sharpening again, and that's actually countering it. So what we want to do now is actually reduce the sharpening effect on some of this, so we can reduce that down if we want to slightly, and we can actually change the order of these, and we can now start to mask out some of the areas where we've got too much blur. So we add a mask to this, we'll select a paintbrush, we've got the opacity up at 45, I'll leave it at about 40. I've got black paint selected and I've got a soft edge. So let's now actually start to paint in the detail on some of these rocks. A little bit of the grass there as well. Some of this path going through here. This rock here and there. And the rocks here as well. And I'll just dial down the opacity a little bit more now and start to work on the field in the distance. And the blur, soft blur with the soft light may be a little bit strong, so I can just reduce that. If you think that the darkening effect is too dark in some of the shadows, what you can do is mask that one out as well. So again, I'll just start to mask out some of these areas. I'll make my opacity just that little bit stronger. And we can mask out some of the shadows where the effect may be too strong. Now clearly I've created this in a little bit of a rush, and you would take a little bit more time when you're doing it, but ultimately two ways there that you can use the frequency separation. You can use it for sharpening, but you can also use it for blurring and creating this Orton effect as well. There's the original image, there's the adjusted image. As you can see, it's got a much more atmospheric effect to it. I hope you found that useful and that it's given you some ideas of how you can use the effect in your own work. I'm Whalley, you've been watching Lenscraft. I'll see you next week for another video.